Well, I was born in New York City in 1946. My parents were refugees from Nazi Germany, so they had come to the United States pretty much to save their lives. And my parents split up when shortly after I was born. And my mother eventually moved myself and my sister to California, where she had a brother who was the person who had sponsored her and my father to come to the United States, because you needed a financial sponsor in order to get out of Europe. And we grew up in a house that he owned in Los Angeles. And I think my family's early experience had a huge impact on me, because most of my family had been killed in the war, and my parents had gone through the loss of their country and their identity. And so I think, as I look back on it, that feeling of being at risk, that you lived in a society but the society could potentially turn against you, was it was a theme in my life, in my upbringing. It was a message. It wasn't an explicit message, but all my mother's friends were refugees. They'd all lost their families, and they had been, very devoted Germans. They were part of German culture. They lived in a middle-class Jewish neighborhood in Berlin. And losing that culture and having it turn against them was forever a shock for them. Mm-hmm. And it resonated in my generation, I think. It resonated in the next generation in different ways. But for me, it was, I think, part of my searching for a political community, an accepting community, and an activist community. Mm-hmm. I lived in a co-op where, you got reduced rent if you worked cooking and cleaning in the co-op. So I had a little bit of a community, but I was really searching for a community where my presence, my existence actually mattered. And I got quickly drawn to the civil rights community at Berkeley and the Congress of Racial Equality. And I found that when I went to those meetings, they really needed me, and they really appreciated my presence. And I got training in nonviolent civil disobedience and the whole philosophy of civil disobedience, and I got solely involved in CORE and various campaigns against Sambo's Restaurant, which had a very racist advertising. It had a little black Sambo being chased by a tiger, yet they wouldn't hire African Americans, in the restaurants and Lucky markets. And then when I turned 18, I was able to participate in civil disobedience. And so, and the Sheraton Plaza Hotel, there were massive demonstrations there for hiring rights for African Americans. But shortly after I turned 18, I got arrested in a mass demonstration in San Francisco against the auto industry, the retail showrooms that would not hire blacks. And about 500 of us spread out over Van Ness Boulevard in all these luxury car dealerships, and we slid underneath. I was in the Chrysler showroom. I don't think I've been in a Chrysler showroom since. And I slid under the car, and we waited for the police to come and arrest us. Which they did. Took a really long time. We were put into jail for 12 hours or so, and then we were all charged with disturbing the peace, failure to disperse, trespassing. I think those were the 3 charges. And then that summer, 1964, we were tried in groups of 10. And we basically tied up the court system with, and this is what the free speech movement was all about. The business community in San Francisco and the Bay Area and the courts were being locked down by the activities of the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement was recruiting from the universities. And so they were trying to stop it. And that was when they tried to stop the recruiting desks at Berkeley And that's what led to the free speech movement. It had to do with these mass arrests and mass demonstrations that students were engaged in. So anyway, in 1964, I spent the summer in court. And my most notable experience was that we were represented by pro bono attorneys, and their defense was the history of civil disobedience in American history and the legitimacy of civil disobedience as not being illegal, but being part of the political tradition. So we learned about the history of civil disobedience, which none of us really knew anything about, by sitting in court. And my lawyer was an African American who had served in World War II and had liberated a concentration camp, and he spoke German. And so during the lunch breaks, we would speak German together and we would talk about the war. And he was the first person in my life outside of my family who actually understood what had gone on in Europe. So it was, just makes me cry to think about it. It was, it was like a connection between my family history and the civil rights movement. And it just like, it bound me to that movement. And he had a lot to do with it. It was a very profound moment for me. And so we were in court when the 1964 Freedom Summer was going on, and we were aware Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman had been killed. And the Southern Civil Rights Movement was asking students to come south. And when I finished that year of school, 1965, so I went back after my trial, 1965, I decided to spend that summer in Mississippi. And there was a whole recruiting process you had to go through, and I got accepted, and so I went there in June. Well, when I went to Mississippi, I felt like I went to another country. It was so poor and so rural. And we were on Red Dog Road, and the water service, the electricity service, the phone service all stopped at the beginning of Red Dog Road. There were no utilities in the black community at all. And people lived in these little unpainted wooden shacks. It was almost all one family, the Wilder family, who had a bunch of brothers and then their wives and their kids. And I lived with Emma Wilder, who was the grandmother, who was in her 90s. Yeah, they had no plumbing. They used outdoor, they used slop pots for the night and outhouses. I felt like I was in another world, and they felt like I was otherworldly because I was a white woman, and it was me and a white guy and my boyfriend for a while, and then he left. So everybody wanted me to stay at their house. It was really interesting. And so I would stay at different houses because it was like, it was really weird. It was a big deal for a white person to be present in their homes and in their communities. So, and I didn't really know very much what I was doing, and we tried our best. My mother would send us, you know, arts and crafts things that we could use with the kids for the Freedom School. She sent us a mimeograph machine so we could do flyers. We would go door to door, although it wasn't like door to door. It was like walking down that country road until you found a house there in the clearing amongst the trees and knock on the door and say you were a freedom worker, you know. And yeah, it was an unbelievable experience. And then we had someone who joined our project, and we didn't know where he came from. He was a white guy named Tom Mosier, and he said we weren't militant enough. And he allied with some of the younger guys, the teenagers, and he put out very provocative flyers with rifles crossed like this, you know, don't come into our communities, we're ready for you. I don't know, I have some of the flyers still. And it was really a provocation towards the white community. And the person I worked with, Bob, and myself, we went to Canton, Mississippi to try to tell them. They were a much bigger staff, what was going on. No one paid attention. And so the next time we tried to demonstrate in the capital, Carthage, the capital, my coworker got beaten up. His head got split. You know, he had to have stitches. He was taken to the hospital. He went back to California and I never saw him again. Mm-hmm. So this guy, Tom Mosier, was a provocateur. And years later, I saw he wrote an article in the Reader's Digest about how he infiltrated the New Left. But even then, he had showed up in Chicago when I was working in Jordan. I told people, this guy, you can't trust him. But we were all so naive about being infiltrated. Who would do that? We're just trying to do the right thing, you know. So that was very upsetting, and everybody was agitated, and we were afraid the white, you know, the white toughs would drive through Red Dog Road and shoot it up, and people were on their porches with rifles, but nothing happened after that one attack. Tom left. We never did a flyer like that again. Challenges in Join was to find people who actually could survive, who had a stable life, who could actually engage in group activities, because people were sick, alcoholic, so lumpen, so marginal. And there was kind of a disagreement in Join, who do you organize? And one guy, Rennie Davis, organized the drunks a lot, you know, because they were really nice guys and he could get them to do anything, and they'd demonstrate here and do this and that. But others of us felt these are people, not people who can be self-determining. You need to find the more stable elements in the community, people who could be raised into leadership. So Virginia Bowers was one of them. Peggy Terry was another. Big and Little Dovey, these two African-American women. And my job, I felt as an organizer, was to go door to door and find other people who had their lives, even though they were struggling, had their lives more in order, who could actually be organized. And it was a hard job to find. You'd find people in such need that the first thing you wanted to do was go and get them food because they didn't have enough food. And then another element in Join decided to organize young boys, feeling that they were kind of a militant vanguard, and the guys, you know, it was guys organizing guys, and their issue was police harassment, and so they did these demonstrations against the police, and eventually the police planted heroin in our office and shut us down. They raided us and shut us down. I mean, in Join, because of the democratic machine, we could not win anything. We'd have a campaign for a stoplight because a lot of kids would get hit, you know, at a particular intersection. The machine would not allow us to win a stoplight because they wanted to continue the structure where the only way you got anything was to work through your precinct captain and your ward committeeman. So we could not win anything. So then we would organize for certain things in the war on poverty. We could not win anything. I mean, it was a way, because to build a community organization, you have to have some progress. People don't want to just work and work and work and never win anything. So the machine wanted to shut us down, and they eventually shut us down in 1967. One of the young guys planted dope or heroin in the office. The police came and found it. They shut us down. My partner, I think he was my husband then, his name was on the lease, and he had to go through a big trial. He ended up getting exonerated, but so we were discredited in the neighborhood. You know, the police told everybody we had heroin in our office. We were all drug addicts, and that pretty much ended it. But It was questionable whether you could really build an organization in such an impoverished community. It was very, very hard. You know, those of us who were women had a much easier job getting people to open the door and talk to us. And we talked to mostly women. We had to be careful if a man and a woman opened the door together, you know, that the men didn't pay a lot of attention to us and the woman might feel threatened, so we would focus on the woman. The women were the more stable people in the couples that we engaged. I mean, all our top leaders were, except for these group of alcoholics that Rennie thought were really brilliant leaders, who ended up accidentally burning the joint office down by falling asleep on a couch with a cigarette. It was mostly women. Virginia, Peggy, the Doveys. So Diane and I were organizers, and we would go door to door on a very disciplined schedule every day, knock on doors, trying to identify what the issues were for the families in the community. And we discovered that access to affordable food was a big thing. So we started a food buying club, like a food co-op, where we bought in bulk, and then people bought, you know, they would be members, they paid a certain amount of members, we would go down to the wholesale food market and then just redistribute the food. There was a lot of interest in childcare. We tried a childcare co-op. That didn't really work so well. Got involved in a lot of tenants' rights things around rats and cockroaches, you know, doing rent strikes to try to get landlords to clean up their buildings. But the skills that I learned doing that, I mean, within 30 seconds after you knock on a door, you have to be able to engage the person. And I felt like I learned how to do that, to kind of read where the person was at and to try to get the person to talk with me about what was going on in their life. And I actually really loved it. I loved meeting people that way, sitting around the kitchen table, having those one-on-ones. Yeah, I really loved it. And then there was the Native American population too, and there was the Chicago Indian Center that opened after a while. So that was interesting. It was a very interesting neighborhood. And then a lot of the buildings were owned by Jews. So that was another interesting thing, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism amongst the renters, because they thought all Jews were rich. And when I would tell people I was Jewish, they just would not believe it. They just... So it was like an ethnic hodgepodge, you know. And you know, the organizing in the western suburbs, there was, high school kids were, because of the war in Vietnam and the draft and the general kind of agitation that was going on in the society, there was a lot of interest in those areas for young people within the youth community to organize. So that was one of the reasons I got fired. I think the Y got scared of how much energy there was, and we started a coffee house in a church basement, a Lutheran basement, and this right-wing group shot crossbows and arrows into the basement and said this was like a communist den. But there were a lot of kids there. They were looking for a place to be together. You know, coffee houses were like a big deal for high school kids. And then these underground newspapers where kids were trying to find out who they were in the world and what was the meaning of life, and how could there be this horrible war in Vietnam, and what were they going to do about the draft. And Fred Hampton actually would meet with my groups of kids. They had never talked to a black person before, and he was just wonderful with them. They adored him. And when he was killed, they all went to his funeral. They were like the only white people in the church, and there were all these Panthers with guns and berets, and here I was with this group of white kids. It was amazing. Yeah, they adored him. He was a remarkable guy. I think I think I pulled together a group that was going to organize a founding conference. And it was a question whether there should be a separate women's organization. And we invited people to come and say, I mean, we thought for sure, no question, we needed a separate women's organization. But there were some groups that criticized the idea from the left. And they brought papers and argued about that at the founding conference. And Naomi and Amy worked on this poetic and dramatic presentation, the witches thing, which was really beautiful. And so my role was really to build the structure around which other people could make their contributions and make their arguments, and and so as a group we could decide what we wanted to do. Yeah. And it was a big deal to pull away. I mean, first, as white organizers, we were asked to separate from the black community. And then as white women, mostly white women, not all, we decided to pull away from mixed male-female organizations. That was a big step. So just to give you a little background, there were community organizers in Chicago when I got there that were in like an organizers grouping. And as the Black Power movement got stronger, the black organizers, including James Bevel and, Bernard Lafayette, some of the black organizers who had worked in the South, they decided that the white organizers should separate and form a white organizers union, and the black community was going to organize separately. And it was a very painful separation, especially for those of us who'd been in the civil rights movement. And we did form a white organizers union, and we organized it into what we called cells, so that in each little grouping there were people working in different parts of the city so we could stay together. And that was how, one of the ways that we developed relationships across the city. So Amy was working in Rogers Park, and I think that's how I got to know Amy. So, people say, oh, the Women's Union was so white. Well, we weren't really supposed to be organizing African Americans at that time. It was really seen that should be done by black organizers. So there were African American women in the Women's Union, but the movement was really seen at that time already it would be more powerful for women of color and people of color to be in their own organizations, Latino organizations, black organizations. So we were in white. As I recall, people felt that women's issues were bourgeois issues, that they were not really revolutionary issues, and we were supposed to be about building a revolution. And then I was mentored by, Rich and I were kind of adopted by this older couple who had been in the Communist Party, Jessie Proston and Ann Proston, and he was a leader in the packing house workers, a brilliant labor leader, very much beloved. And she was very active around school issues and in the Communist Party. So she took me out for dinner, for a prime rib dinner, which when you wanted to have a serious conversation in Chicago at the time, you took someone out for prime rib. And we met in the Loop, and I knew she wanted to talk to me about something. She wanted to talk to me about how women's liberation would divide the working class. And it was really a mistake for me to start organizing a separate women's organization. And before long, the conversation turned to how she was treated in the Communist Party, and how she was never really listened to, and how the women had to make the food and be the hostesses, and the pain that she had around that. And so she didn't convince me, but it was a very heartfelt effort to try to say that it would divide the working class, which it does in some ways, yeah. But it builds the working class too, because then you have another half of women with a voice. But that was a big deal. And then, of course, there was certain hostility from the men on the left, and some of it was out of fear, you know, that they would be left without their beloved community and less beloved. It was less beloved than they thought, but it was like a whole new world opened for us. Those of us who were organizers, women organizers, it was like a whole new world. It was half the population. We could do the strategy, we could do the position papers, we could make the speeches, we could run the meetings. We had a speakers bureau, you probably know about, in CWLU, where we trained each other to be speakers, and people went on television. That was all stuff that just men did before. It was huge. Yeah. Anyway, it was kind of, you know, we learned later that there was pretty much an agent in every peace group that we were in. And there was the Chicago Red Squad that paid attention to meetings that we went to. And like I said last night, they would greet us at the door. There was one guy who was assigned to the New Left, I guess, and he knew all of our names. And he would be there from the Chicago police in plain clothes, greeting us as we went to any kind of anti-war meeting or anything. So
Did you know he was with the Red Squad?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we knew he was with the police department. We didn't know there was a distinct thing at that time called the Red Squad. So it felt, Chicago felt like a police state. And my going to North Vietnam is now like a point of pride for me. But I didn't talk about it for years. And even once, I worked for the city of Santa Monica for like 5 years. I've been very active there politically. And once someone mentioned from the dais that I had gone to North Vietnam as if it was a good thing, and I just panicked because for years it was something I was afraid to talk about. I felt like really put me at risk. Even though it was an undeclared war, you know, there was no reason why a citizen couldn't go there. But of course now there's no way for a citizen, like during the war in Iraq, you'd have to be embedded with an army unit. There was no way to do what we did, a citizen fact-finding trip to bring information back to the American people. There's nothing like that during the Iraq war. No opportunity to talk to people and get a different point of view. So you can see it was not something the government liked, and they got rid of it. But so I think that it wasn't just going to North Vietnam. I think many of us felt that the government considered us an enemy, and certainly Richard Nixon did with the Counter-Pro project, and J. Edgar Hoover did. So it was a certain kind of feeling about your own country that even though you felt like you were doing what a citizen should be doing, you really felt like you were treated like a renegade and an enemy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was a little bit of that in the women's movement. Years later, when a bunch of us got our Red Squad files, I never got my whole files, but I got the index cards that referenced my files. And there was an informant in every group I was in. Every West Suburban Women's Strike for Peace had an informant. I mean, every little group. Yeah, so it was just the times.